hey, supply chain team actually can help in these meaningful ways, and they can have those experiences, and it's only going to motivate them to encourage them to engage them in the future. So John's right. It's not just a process thing. It's a culture of partnership.
Without supplies, there's no surgery. Without products, there's no patient care. Welcome to Power Supply, the healthcare supply chain podcast focused on helping you navigate the intricacies of logistics, purchasing, contracting, and supplier relationships. Each episode, we speak with healthcare executives, supply chain leaders, and innovative entrepreneurs from across the country as they share their stories, experience, and expertise on the industry we love. From the loading dock to strategic sourcing, from buyers to the C-suite and across the enterprise, we tackle the real-life issues impacting the healthcare supply chain. Whether you're tuning in for conversation or inspiration, we're glad you're here. You're just in time to hear it from the source and stock up on insight. So sit back and plug into Power Supply.
On this episode of Power Supply, we are going to be speaking with Sarah Hatchett, Chief Information Officer, and John Dockins, Executive Director, Sourcing and Vendor Management with the Cleveland Clinic. And if you're out there and you're thinking, oh, IT is so intimidating, well, John and Sarah are here to tell you that getting involved with IT and your sourcing strategy and initiatives does not have to be intimidating. And as a matter of fact, their subject matter expertise in collaborating and working together is exactly the highlight of today's episode, Hayes.
It is, and they basically gave us a roadmap. So if you really want to know what it is, you better stick around. Come on and join us.
All right, we're going to be right back with Sarah and John. Stay with us after a short break.
Bam! I'm Hayes Walder.
This is Gary Skinner.
And I'm Justin Poulin.
From the studios of Healthcare HQ, you're listening to Power Supply.
Joining us now, Sarah Hatchett, Chief Information Officer, and John Dockins, Executive Director, Sourcing and Vendor Management with the Cleveland Clinic. And I got to say, I feel like this is the season of the clinic. Just 2 episodes ago, John, we had your colleague Steve Downey on for his second appearance. Did a great job talking about OTIF and giving us some updates on some work that's being done across the industry around that. But it's great to have you and Sarah on for the first time. And we're going to be talking about IT sourcing. And it shouldn't be as scary as it may be for some of you who are listening to this episode. We're going to tell you why today. You're all going to become subject matter experts in supply chain by the end of this one. John, thanks so much for coming on the show. And Sarah, you as well.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Let's start with just how did the two of you begin working together? Was there a specific project? Was there something that kind of just got you engaged? And how did that start to evolve?
Yeah, I can start, John. I joined the Cleveland Clinic about 7 years ago. My first job was rolling out a major transformation project across our entire enterprise. And if you can think about the Cleveland Clinic enterprise as 80,000 caregivers across the entire U.S., multiple physical locations, all going through a major upgrade of our electronic healthcare record system. I pretty immediately had to hit the ground running with a whole series of contracts, staff aug, tools, technology, hardware, all of the above. I had to learn by fire, if you will, in understanding our processes. And John and team were extremely helpful in not only helping us navigate those challenges, but really securing the best deals, if you will, given the breadth and depth of that particular program. So really from day one, I learned the importance of partnership with supply chain.
What was your experience with supply chain before that? I mean, just, going back in your career, how often had you engaged supply chain in the past? I mean, obviously this was a big project, so it was more involved, but had you had much experience previously?
Well, it's actually interesting because I was a contractor before that time. So my experience was on the receiving end, if you will. I had no signing authority. I just sort of knew how the system worked. So I jumped right in and got a chance to kind of learn both sides of the equation.
John, maybe give us a background on yourself and also like how involved had you been with IT, prior to starting to work with Sarah?
Yeah, so it's hard to believe, Sarah, you've only been here 7 years. It seems like you and I have worked together for much longer. But yeah, so Cleveland Clinic started the indirect, right? I'll use that phrase, indirect sourcing journey 15 plus years ago. IT specifically was around 9 years ago. There was always this loose connection between IT and supply chain. And by loose, I mean there was one or two people in supply chain that sort of helped, but sort of didn't. And you would probably see that model more consistent today, right, across other health systems. So about 9 years ago, we just made that switch and we built the relationships up. Obviously, Sarah came in, we continued that. We just continued to build it out and keep going with IT and helping build that strategy around sourcing and procurement.
And so what's kind of your philosophy? Because I feel like I teed it up. Like, I think a lot of people are intimidated by getting engaged with IT and supply chain. And, I feel like a lot of times you'll look at departments like pharmacy, and they're definitely led by pharmacists. And it kind of built out this whole, pharmacy sourcing, division. But there aren't necessarily people with supply chain experience. And if you look at contingent workforce and contingent labor, we're starting to see more and more supply chain involvement in that area. But there was almost like these taboo departments that supply chain traditionally wouldn't get involved with. And I just kind of wondered, what was the philosophy maybe overarching that not only led to you working closely with Sarah, but just maybe all the different departments that traditionally have been somewhat avoided?
Yeah, I would say it starts with a fundamental understanding of spend, right? So let's just take loose numbers, right? Clinical, a third, pharmaceutical, a third. We could argue that's much higher now given the current state. But like if you just say clinical spend, clinical supplies is a third of the spend, pharmacy is a third of that, indirect makes up the other third. So why ignore it? Like, it's just a fundamental thinking of in our home budgets and finances, we're not going to ignore a third of our expenses if we're trying to manage our own personal budget. So why would we do that at work and then at the provider level? So we started there. Of course, we went into places where relationships were already built, facilities or others. Yeah, there's some still departments that maybe are less opening or welcoming for that. But we just started with the fundamental philosophy of like, why would we ignore the spend? Then we just started to go after it. We started to build the relationships based off of trust, bring the data, and then really get in there and ask the questions, the who, what, when, why, and try to understand the pain points of those business leaders so that we could try to help.
But as I sit here and just think about this, I mean, in the last 10 years, there's virtually, I know we're talking about sourcing, but there's not a product that comes into that hospital now that generally doesn't touch IT somewhere. Internet of Things. I mean, all these different things, it seems to me you must have a really good relationship or it's just not going to work. I mean, is that your experience as well?
Yeah, I'll start, sir, if you would like to add in. But, I think for us, you start with this fundamental like price, efficiency, and use, right? You hear more about that in the clinical space, like it's price at the pump. What are you paying for the SKU level stuff, right? Efficiency, that can mean a lot of different things. Could be formulary alignment and then use, how much you're using. Is it really that much different, though, in IT? I mean, we're still buying hardware. We're still buying software licenses, right? Duplication of technology. And I know when Sarah and I first started working, there was a lot of discussions around like, what duplication of technology do we have? Do we have two software packages that do the same thing? So it's really not that different if you set aside maybe some of that fear that you were talking about earlier, Justin, and just deal with it on a people level and build relationships. And obviously it helps to have great partners like Sarah.
Yeah, and I think there's benefits on my end as well. So, Hayes, you mentioned things like Internet of Things and how much is connected to our network. When we're looking at improving our cybersecurity maturity and our posture and building a strong cybersecurity program, supply chain becomes a funnel for me. Like they have visibility into all of those purchases that might introduce new risk. So one of the very first things that we did when we wanted to provide more cybersecurity controls was tap into supply chain. I asked my supply chain partners to say, please don't sign anything until it's gone through a cybersecurity review. Now, there was a business impact to doing that, but it definitely improved our risk posture and helped us feel more confident that we had visibility into everything that was going into our environment.
Sarah, when you were a contractor, were you working exclusively in healthcare or were you in all kinds of industries?
That's right. I have 20 years of experience in healthcare IT.
Wow. So what was your kind of perspective on the maturity level of IT, in general, and maybe even sourcing and contracting from a general perspective when you were kind of on the outside and working with so many different healthcare organizations?
Well, it's an interesting question because I do feel like healthcare IT consulting is a bit of a land of its own, if you will. There's a specialized skill set associated with it, but it's also a broad talent pool. So, which vendors are going to be able to provide the access to the most resources when there's not a lot of loyalty on those consultants between the firms themselves? I think it's just a really interesting scenario. Now, I think we have reached a point of saturation of that talent pool. Now that I'm on the other side of the table, there's more of a saturation than there was back 10, 15 years ago when some of these technologies were emerging. There's also an increased market share from companies like Epic and Cerner. So you're seeing much more of consolidation. And again, those skill sets are becoming much more available in the marketplace.
Did that assist you with implementation? I mean, you talked about a large-scale implementation that really drew you two together, but having gone through so many of those, did that make you maybe more well-equipped for the project?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. We were searching for a strategic partner who is going to be able to be with us for the long term, who is going to be, offering favorable pricing and knowing just the turnover that's going to happen throughout the course of the project. So we were able to structure a contract that met our business needs, but was also competitive from a supply chain standpoint. So it was a great success and something that I'll always use as a best practice.
Sarah, you rolled into a best practice question. I finally get to ask a question. I feel like Justin took over again. Hayes got one line in. I mean, no, it's all good. All good.
We're trying to cut your microphone, so I guess it's not working now.
Aaron,
so Aaron, in that case, go ahead and ask your question.
Oh, my gosh. Thanks, Hayes. I appreciate it. But no, I really like hearing the conversation of the collaboration between Sarah and John on this. I think it's very important. But what question I want to ask, and I think our listeners would probably like to hear, is where's the handoff start? Where does the opportunity hand off to supply chain sourcing and contracting with the vendor? Sarah, where do you start? Do you grab a proposal? You need this many licenses. You've audited it. You're moving to an ERP transformation, whatever it is it you're doing the SME work, subject matter expert work first, and you grab it and you get the proposals, and then you pull in John? Maybe share some of those best practices, the process, and where you bring in to really collaborate and really use the most effective time, the lean, the 5S project, whatever you want to call it. What works best in your world? Maybe just share a little bit if that's a good question or not, I hope.
A long one.
Yeah, well, the easy, quick answer is the earlier the better. IT is a service organization just like supply chain. So the types of projects that we receive are typically business requests. And they often come to us half-baked or fully baked. And we have to deal with that. I've seen everything from, hey, we signed this contract, help us plug it in, all the way to, hey, I have an idea. I have no idea where to start, though, with doing product evaluations and that sort of thing. So regardless of where the business is at in their ideation process, I think having supply chain engaged at the start is really helpful. I think part of what makes technology a bit complex is that not only is it technically complex, like there's so many different components that need to be, outlined contractually, but as an operating model, we're complex. We have a centralized IT function, but there's also distributed IT. And then, of course, you have practitioners who think they know IT. And so we have the same challenges as well, that we want to make sure we're partnering closely with the business on what it is that they need. And really from that point on, creating sort of a customized roadmap or a customized plan for that individual need. It might be strategic sourcing, like, yeah, let's go do a vendor evaluation, a market evaluation. Let's go find something that seems new, or it might just be, they've already sort of done that themselves, and we need to sort of deal with the outcomes of that. So yeah, I definitely think it's really important that the soonest that, there's any sort of purchasing involved in the project, that we're letting our supply chain partners know well in advance. And the same goes for contract renewals. John and I have talked about how the same discipline that we're doing for like new things should also be for contracts. Just because it's something that we have in place today doesn't mean it's the right solution for our organization. So we really have to stay ahead of those things and make sure that we're in lockstep.
How often are your contract templates changing?
The templates themselves, not very often, but we're constantly updating certain clauses. So it depends on how you want to look at that, right? Like there's a lot of updates around breach notice and third-party risk clauses and things like that. So that's an evolution that's constantly changing, but the templates themselves don't change that often.
Are those updates more frequent for IT than other departments, or that's still more of a global?
Yeah, still more of a global. I don't think we have any more template changes happening in the IT space or in the indirect space as a whole as we would anywhere else. But if I could, Gary, could I weigh in on part of your question? I would just add a couple things to what Sarah said. Like, I think if in the world of relationships or partnerships, it's got to go both ways, right? And so as much as, what Sarah said is, they're trying to engage my team as early as possible, but we're doing the opposite. So that distributed IT or anyone in the business that shows up at supply chain's door and says, here's a contract, I need you to go sign it. It is our responsibility as a good partner to Sarah and her team to be like, okay, the first door is actually over at IT, right? You need to go run the IT intake process and make sure that the technology aligns, that there's no cyber risk, right? There's not duplication. So I think that relationship has to go both ways, and we need to do our job to support Sarah and her team to make sure that what we're procuring is the right things for the organization.
Just to add on to that, I think I've had success in building that muscle into my team because there's a value proposition there, right? It's not just, follow the steps, do the checklist, you must. It's, hey, supply chain team actually can help in these meaningful ways, and they can have those experiences, and it's only going to motivate them to encourage them to engage them in the future. So John's right. It's not just a process thing. It's a culture of partnership.
And you went right where I was going to go for my second quick comment, Sarah, is to compare and contrast again to clinical, which most people are used to, right, versus maybe the IT or the indirect side. Common phrases are like, let's let the physicians and the nurses practice at the top of licensure, right? I'm sure many people have heard that. Why would that be any different for Sarah and her team, right? Sarah's leadership team is hired to run the day-to-day operation and the strategy around IT. So why would we want them to have to take time out of their busy day to go get quotes and go do RFPs and negotiate contract? And that's what we're here as a partner. So it's that value proposition that Sarah said, and it's a two-way street, 100%.
That was really good. Really good. I like that.
And John, I like what you said there too, because the operations piece, right? They're not just outsourcing, contracting, negotiating. And I think, Sarah, you brought up a really good point too of looking at auto renews too, like contracting. How far are we looking out, right? It's hitting our desk. Oh my gosh, 30 days this is expiring. 90 days is expiring. Oh my gosh, this is a $4.9 million contract and it's expiring in 6 months. Time to start looking at it now to see if they're meeting the expectations, if they're where they need to be moving forward. And then to your point, do we need to go out for bid? Do we need to look at another option? Do we need to consolidate, right? So I want to ask that question. How much reversal, John, are you working with Sarah on the contracts that are coming up? How are you positioning that back and forth to make sure you're supporting IT? Are you looking out down the road? How often? Are you looking at RFPs? Yeah, that process a little bit too, if you would share.
Yeah, I think we do okay at that. It is definitely a topic, to Sarah's point, that we are not happy with status quo. So we're constantly pushing out, and how much further out can we go, right? I would say, for to your example, Gary, and I know you're probably just, throwing it off the top of your head, but like a $5 million agreement 6 months out is probably not soon enough.
Correct.
Right? It also depends on how it fits into Sarah's overall strategy, right? Like if it's something that's really a strategic lever or part of Sarah's goals for 2025, the more we know that, the more we can pull things forward. And, some contracts we may not touch until they come time to renew. Others we can pull forward and look at a renegotiation or potential out clause or something. So there's all sorts of levers. I think that's one of the areas that I think, Sarah and I've been spending a lot more time trying to figure out, like cost containment and those type of levers that we can pull, and not just taking the status quo.
Nice.
Yeah, I think to create a real competitive position on a rebid, you actually need to have enough time to actually make the switch if that is what you decide to do. And in the IT space, that stuff doesn't happen overnight. So if you build out a critical path for a major piece of software, for example, you need to be well ahead of any contract dates to be thinking about this.
It's a post-implementation after the signature of the agreement that has to take place 100%. Yep.
What about your value analysis approach? Because I think, we had a chance to connect ahead of time, and I wondered how involved IT had become in the value analysis, just sort of philosophy and operational tasking, et cetera. But you brought up your architectural review board. So maybe we can use that as sort of the construct for the answer to the question, because I believe that's a big part of your value analysis process, is it not?
So I'm going to rewind it back to when it was a thought, and this is credit to Sarah and the leadership team in IT. And it was that partnership that I think Sarah hit on, is like, okay, how do they help, or how do they get supply chain to help them achieve some of their targets? Now, for that is like, okay, how do we get a handle on duplication of technology? How do we start getting our arms around decentralized IT and, different business units thinking, well, it's my money, I should be able to go buy what I want, right? All of those, typical talk tracks. The thought for me, and again, I'll compare it with the clinical side. Most people are familiar with value analysis, whether it's value analysis boards, value analysis committees, a group of clinicians who make decisions on the products you buy. Again, why is that any different for technology, right? And so I think for me, supporting Sarah and the team as they stood up years ago, the architectural review board, it's the same type of philosophy and thinking. Why would supply chain not be part of value analysis and the committees and the boards there? So why would we think that we shouldn't be a part of architectural review board and be able to bring that partnership and support there? Because again, sometimes we hear about it first and we can help Sarah and the team corner that. But really, to me, it's just a comparison of value analysis. Architectural review board is just what we call it internally for the IT space.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add to that is, just like the technology itself is becoming increasingly complex, the cost implications are becoming complex. If you think about the transition from on-prem to cloud-based solutions, there's a whole bunch of trade-offs and levers and things that need to be evaluated for every different type of thing. So to some extent, all of those things should be governed by overarching strategies, but each contract is almost like hand-to-hand combat to be able to figure out how do we get the best outcome that's going to drive the most value for the clinic. As a nonprofit organization, and a healthcare industry that's facing increasingly cost pressures, everything has to come with a business case. And those sorts of things get tracked over time. It's not like, oh, we did a business case, we signed the deal, it's done. No, there's actually savings targets that need to be met, and those are tracked through cradle to grave through the process. So that discipline up front really helps us in meeting and achieving our goals long term. And like John said, we probably have opportunities. We could probably do a better job at that. But I do think that helps build the confidence. So in the future, when I have to make an investment that doesn't necessarily have the strongest ROI, it shows that we actually have the discipline around the stewardship of our spend overall, and that we're really being thoughtful about it.
How much of your initiatives are cost savings? Because I feel like with technology, right, it's like everybody's trying to leverage technology more. to try to increase efficiencies, et cetera. But I feel like that sometimes makes the cost savings approach a little more elusive, because there's maybe even some shifting in terms of just like where you're allocating resources, just from a resiliency standpoint, right? If you're doing something that's manual that you can then make electronic, on paper, it really doesn't look like a savings. But in the end, if you think about the cost of employee turnover and just how much waste goes into bringing somebody in new, and the loss of just that cultural knowledge or that expert knowledge in that role, technology can really help with that, right? So how do you evaluate, do you evaluate it really as cost savings, or are you looking more for operational efficiencies on the whole?
Yeah, so just to be clear, our priority is always patient safety and quality first. That's our brand. That's what we're known for. And so many times these ideas, these projects come through and there isn't an ROI, but it's the right thing to do for our patients. It's the right thing to do for our caregivers. So with that as our North Star, there's a whole tier of other things that, of course, need to come with some rationalization, some cost savings. I certainly wouldn't say that everything we do is driven by cost savings, but it does need to be cost conscious. So if there is, for example, we're going to be buying this new software, well, what gets sunsetted because of this? Or how do we gain hard efficiencies because of this? Or how are we keeping the FTEs that support it as stable over time? Or how do we generate those efficiencies over time? So those are definitely the questions that we're faced with as we make these sorts of investments. And, I've learned you better have a great answer for that. Otherwise it's going nowhere.
But it just seems to me, as I kind of mentioned earlier, having that two-way communication between supply chain and technology is crucial, because it does seem to me that probably 80-90% of every company out there has a product now. It touches your network in somewhere, at least they want it to. And I would just think, if you don't have a really sound infrastructure foundation, it's just going to spin out of control. So, I would think everybody listening to this would definitely better do it, or they're going to be in a bad bind, I would think, at some point.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I also think, again, we're not immune. And in fact, we're perhaps even overly sensitive to this. Many corporations are looking at consolidating onto enterprise platforms and standardizing, software tools. Like, those are the sorts of things that should be first and foremost when you're thinking about guiding principles or enterprise architecture, if you will. It's extremely important, because not only does that reduce cost, which is really important, but it standardizes the experience, it reduces variability, less data loss risk. Those sorts of things are sort of the bread and butter of what we have a starting position on.
Yeah, Hayes, I think your point is spot on. So in today's world, technology is not servers and softwares and network switches, right? It's hospital beds that are connected to the network. It's sprinkler systems connected to the network. It's wireless pacemakers, right? Like, all of that information. And so what we do in supply chain is help connect those dots, right? Back to what we said. So if the clinical team is doing a new contract for a surgical robot that is going to have PHI and connect to the network, right? Typically that team is really, really strong in the agreement for the robot and the consumables. But we have a handoff process on our team where they can phone a friend in the IT sourcing component and call them in and say, hey, can you take a look at the software provision that's going to run this robot? Can you put your eyes on it and see if we need to get this over to architecture review board? So behind the scenes, the different sourcing teams are connecting those dots to products and services that normally, historically, people might not have thought as technology, but they really are absolutely connected to the network. And if it connects to the network, Sarah's team's got to be involved.
John, I appreciate giving props to Hayes. He feels better today now. It builds his ego a little bit, so he feels good,
Thank you.
But just to add on to that conversation, the connection between you and Sarah, are you seeing more? I mean, we're talking about biomed to capital to beds, all these pieces that are really, truly touching at a rate that I don't know if we can keep up. Is legal being more involved on these sourcing and contracting because of the cybersecurity risk, because of where we're at Can you comment on that a little bit too for our listeners?
Yeah, absolutely. So, just like the partnership that I hold dear with Sarah, we have an equal partnership with our internal counsel. Like, there are certain things that we can do in supply chain with business terms and things, but at any moment's notice, we can phone a friend, like I said, and call one of our legal internal counsel, and they are right with it. They're broken up into their practice groups. So there are specific attorneys that only do the IT, software, hardware stuff, and IP. And then there's another different practice group that'll do clinical goods, right? Because again, that specialty is different, right? And so we do have great partnerships with them, and we rely on them very heavily to guide us, especially when we're doing supplier due diligence, or we come across a term, we're like, I don't know about this one. Like, this doesn't feel real good to me. So like, we get our legal counsel involved. They're great partners, and they guide us through all of that.
I know we're getting close to the end, but I know also, Sarah, you mentioned a pretty large project that the two of you have worked on, but maybe list out several of the biggest opportunities that you've collaborated on over the last several years. Either one of you can. I'm very bad at positioning who I want this question to go to. Sarah, why don't you start, and then we'll go to John.
Oh, that's a good question. I would rely on my supply chain partner to pull a list of the major deals and produce that data for me.
Wow, flip the coin.
I love it. That's role model.
Pull that data, John, will you, please?
What happens behind the curtain?
Just one recent example is we just went through an enterprise agreement renewal, and that was, again, similarly a process that we started well in advance of what we thought we would. It was super complex. There were many components to it. I think we hadn't renewed in the 3 years prior. So there was, true ups and net new features that were being added, and, several executive team members, even above me, that needed to be kind of on board. And really, we could not have done that successfully if it wasn't for a deep partnership between our teams. So, sometimes it's like good cop, bad cop, or sometimes it's, checking with benchmarking. Sometimes it's just developing the communications. It's on those big ones, there is no lane where it's like, okay, I'm going to stay in my lane. It's like we just get a working team together and start working through it. So that's the one that comes top of mind just because it's still fresh and to some extent still being discussed. But even though the deal is done, it's still a topic of
it touches everybody in the organization.
Yes.
It's like everybody's going to have an opinion.
Yes, absolutely. So yeah, that's my example.
Yeah, we could probably spend the next 45 minutes talking about large contracts or sourcing efforts, but I hope anyways that the listeners to this, if you think beyond that, right? Because to me, that's the tactical stuff. And frankly, if supply chain's not delivering that as a partnership back to people like Sarah, then like, what are we doing, right? So I think of some of the things we already mentioned, like architecture review board. Recently we've added a spend costs committee. I don't even know if I'm getting the name right, but architecture review board, think of it as it's the technology, right? There's also a component of cost to that. And partnering with Sarah and getting that set up. I would also highlight that Sarah and team specifically Sarah, has been so inviting that the head of my indirect sourcing is considered part of her extended staff, right? And so that's common in finance and HR, right? Like you want to bring your finance partner for your budget stuff. You want to bring your HR partner for talent and turnover and hiring. But not that many people in Sarah's position will say, okay, but supply chain is one of my strategic partners as well, and I'm going to have my sourcing partner at the table for those extended staff meetings. And that is huge because, again, you're just being able to share real-time information of okay, what are we happening here? And at the end of the day, it's just people. So sometimes people forget, sometimes there's different personalities, and being able to have that voice directly to Sarah makes all the difference in the world.
That right there sounded like one of the best closes I've heard on a podcast in a while, John. That was
done.
I think you summed it up perfectly. It's really about the strategy, right? And how do you work together? And it's so clear that there's a huge focus on culture in your organization and culture building, because that's how big things happen. This is a great example of that. And I appreciate you both coming on and sharing that with us today.
Well, thanks for having us. Yeah, it's been good.
Yeah, it was
Sarah,
a pleasure.
keep it up. Keep bringing them to the table.
Exactly.
And John's not lying. Like his person sits on my senior leadership team each week, just right alongside my executive team in IT. And I know that all of my leaders would say the very same thing, that they have a phone a friend type relationship. They know who their person is. They can reach out with any type of questions. It's been a really, really great relationship, and looking forward to keeping it going.
That was Sarah Hatchett, Chief Information Officer, and John Dockins, Executive Director, Sourcing and Vendor Management with the Cleveland Clinic. We're talking about collaboration between supply chain and, we say IT, but IT is probably not even as big of a word as it really is now. It's integrated in everything that we're doing. I love the way that they've worked together, that they've continued to expand their collaboration. The Architectural Review Board, we actually continued the conversation a little bit before we let them go after the interview. And Sarah talked a lot, Gary, about, every single person on her team having, some sort of say, depending on their role within the organization, and making sure that even the smallest contracts, whether they're $10,000 or that they're that $5 million deal that they were talking about, that they're all going through the same process, and everybody with a different perspective on, sort of the standardization on IT is involved in that. And supply chain and the value analysis process really guides that. And so they just have done a nice job of sophistication and building culture to support it. Because it's one thing to say you do it, and it's another thing to do it well together.
Well, Justin, I think you captured it well. 2 words come to mind: transparency and inclusivity on both sides. They work together. One comes to the door on the vendor. They say, you got to walk down the door to see IT. IT says you got to work with strategic sourcing and contracting. So the collaboration that they have, they created a culture, and it's just impressive to see. So it was great podcast today.
Yep. John and Sarah, very well done. Really enjoyed having them on the podcast today. And on behalf of Hayes, Gary, and myself, thanks for listening to this episode of Power Supply.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Power Supply. As a reminder, you can help support us by subscribing on your favorite podcast app or by downloading the smartphone app on your iPhone or Android. Simply search for Power Supply in the App Store or Google Play. The best thing about downloading the smartphone app is that you can access bonus content for certain episodes and view episodes in certain categories, like articles on the go and vendor spotlights. Are you following us on LinkedIn or Facebook yet? If you are and you love an episode or post, then let your social network know about it. Like, comment, or share our posts along with your thoughts and keep the conversation going. If you have any topics or guests that you would like to recommend for a future episode, just send us an email to info@powersupplymedia.net. We look forward to hearing from you.